Clara Whitmore was on her knees on the marble floor of the main hall, wiping the legs of the German grand piano when she heard Richard Belmont's firm footsteps descending the curved staircase. 3 years working in that mansion had taught her to identify each of her employer's moods just by the sound of his shoes on the floor. Today, on the eve of the most important party of the year, he walked with that nervous haste that always appeared when big business was at stake. She pretended not to notice when he stopped at the entrance of the hall watching her work. Richard had this habit of standing still, analyzing, as if evaluating a property he wasn't sure was worth the investment. Clara continued cleaning, focused on doing the job perfectly, as she always did. She couldn't afford to fail at anything. Clara. His voice cut through the morning silence like a dry, authoritative blade, leaving no room for questions. She rose slowly, wiping her hands on her apron before turning around. Richard stood in front of the enormous windows overlooking the property's gardens, where event company employees were already beginning to set up structures for tomorrow night's party. His hands were crossed behind his back, the erect posture he always maintained when he wanted to demonstrate authority. "Yes, Mr. Belmont. Tomorrow night we'll have 200 guests here. The most influential men in the country will be in this room." He turned slowly, and Clara noticed something different in his gaze, a strange, almost cruel gleam she couldn't decipher. They're important people. Investors, businessmen, politicians. People who can make or destroy careers with a simple word. Clara nodded without understanding where he was going with this. In 3 years working in the house, she had seen dozens of parties like this. She always stayed in the background, serving drinks, collecting plates, invisible like a shadow. That's how she liked it. Invisible was safe. "I need to impress these people, show them that I'm not just a successful businessman, but a refined, cultured man." Richard began walking in slow circles around her. Someone who appreciates the fine arts. Clara's stomach began to tighten. She knew that tone, knew that way he spoke when he was plotting something. 3 years had been enough to learn to read the signs. "You know how to play piano?" It wasn't a question. It was a cold statement that made Clara's blood freeze. She hesitated for a fraction of a second. For 3 years, she had been extremely careful never to give hints of her musical training. She never got close to the piano when he was around, never showed knowledge about classical music, never let anything slip that could reveal her past. "A little, Mr. Belmont." The lie came out low, almost inaudible. Richard smiled, but it was a smile without warmth, without humanity. "Don't lie to me, Clara. I know exactly who you are. I know where you came from. I know what you lost." Clara's world seemed to tilt. She felt her legs go weak, her heart race. How did he know? How could he know things she had never told anyone? "Tomorrow during dinner you're going to play for my guests." Richard stopped in front of her, so close she could smell the expensive cologne he wore. "You'll wear your maid's uniform, of course. I want everyone to see how good my taste is, even in choosing my staff." Clara opened her mouth to protest, but no sound came out. The words stuck in her throat, mixed with years of silent humiliation. "There's no room for discussion." Richard raised his hand, cutting off any attempt at response. "So you'll play Chopin, Bach, something these people will recognize and appreciate. And you'll play well, Clara, very well, because if you don't, you can look for another job Monday morning." The ultimatum hung in the air like a physical threat. Clara knew he wasn't bluffing. Richard Belmont never bluffed, and she had nowhere to go. No family, no savings enough to start over somewhere else, no longer the connections she once had in the music world. "Understood, sir. Excellent." Richard smiled again, but this time there was satisfaction in his expression. "Clara, I want you to understand something well. You're not an artist here. You're my maid. A maid who happens to know how to play piano. Don't forget that for a second." He left the room, leaving Clara alone with the piano she cleaned every day but never played. She approached the instrument and ran her fingers over the keys without pressing any. The piano was always perfectly tuned, cared for by a technician who came once a month, but no one ever played it. It was just an expensive decorative piece, like everything else in that house. The rest of the day passed like a blur. Clara performed her tasks on autopilot, cleaning, organizing, supervising the party preparations, but her mind was elsewhere, remembering a time when pianos weren't obstacles to work around during cleaning, but extensions of her own soul. She remembered afternoons at the Royal Conservatory of London when her hands flew across the keys with the confidence of someone born for it. She remembered the applause from professors who said she had a brilliant future ahead. She remembered proud parents in the audience, her mother crying with emotion whenever she performed. And she remembered the accident, the phone call that changed everything, the rushed return to Brazil, the double funeral, the money that ran out, the dreams that died with them. At 6 p.m., Clara went up to her small room on the mansion's top floor. It was a simple, functional space with a single bed, a small wardrobe and a window overlooking the back of the property. She sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the black and white uniform hanging in the closet. Tomorrow she would have to wear that uniform and humiliate herself in front of 200 people. She would have to play music she once loved as entertainment for bored millionaires. She would have to be Richard Belmont's exotic spectacle. But maybe, just maybe, she could truly play again. Even if it was for just a few minutes, even if it was under humiliating circumstances. Her hands had missed the keys for so long that even this seemed better than nothing. The next morning, the mansion buzzed with activity. Florists, waiters, sound technicians, decorators, all running back and forth preparing for the night's party. Clara helped with supervision, checking every detail, ensuring everything was perfect. Richard appeared from time to time to give instructions, but didn't mention the piano again. He didn't need to. The threat had already been made. At 4 p.m., Clara went up to get ready. She took a long bath, trying to relax her tense muscles, combed her hair into a simple, discreet bun, and put on the black and white uniform she hated, but knew made her look exactly like what Richard wanted. A maid. When she came down to the hall at 7 p.m., the party was already beginning. The first guests arrived in imported cars, handed over to valets at the entrance. Men in tuxedos and women in gala dresses crossed the main hall toward the salon, where waiters offered champagne and gourmet appetizers. Clara kept to the shadows, as she always did during parties. She knew this routine by heart: circulate discreetly among guests, offer drinks, collect empty glasses, be useful without being noticed. But today was different. Today she knew that at some point she would be dragged to the center of attention. The guests were exactly the type of people Richard wanted to impress: powerful businessmen, international investors, influential politicians, people accustomed to having everything they wanted when they wanted it, people who saw people like Clara as part of the decoration. Clara observed the conversations, the calculated smiles, the handshakes that sealed million-dollar deals. It was a world she knew from afar, a world where she had once moved as a guest artist, not as a servant. Dinner was served at 9. 5 elaborate courses, expensive wines, conversations about investments and business opportunities. Clara helped serve, keeping her face neutral while listening to fragments of conversations about money, power, and influence. It was after dessert that Richard stood up and tapped a spoon against his crystal glass. The sound echoed through the hall, making all conversations gradually cease. "My dear friends," Richard began, his voice projected to reach all corners of the hall, "I hope you've enjoyed dinner. Now I have a special surprise for you." Clara felt her stomach tighten. It was time. "One of my employees will treat us to some classical music. As you know, I've always appreciated the fine arts, and I believe good music is essential for a perfect evening." Richard gestured toward Clara, and she felt 200 pairs of eyes turn to her simultaneously. The silence that followed was absolute, charged with curiosity and expectation. "Clara, come here." Clara's legs trembled as she began walking between the tables. Each step seemed to echo like thunder in the silent hall. She heard whispers, low comments, muffled giggles. Some women exchanged disdainful looks. Some men made observations about the entertainment Richard had prepared. "How interesting, Richard," said one of the guests, a middle-aged blonde woman with a pearl necklace that probably cost more than Clara's annual salary. "A pianist maid. How creative. Where did you find her?" "At a music school for domestics?" asked another guest, laughing. The comments continued, each more humiliating than the last. Clara kept her face impassive, but inside she felt shattered. Each word was like a stab to her dignity. She reached the piano and her hands trembled as she opened the lid. The instrument was magnificently tuned, as always. It was an imported Steinway, a work of art worth more than most people earned in a lifetime. Clara sat on the padded bench and for a moment was paralyzed. Her hands hovered over the keys, visibly trembling. She could feel all eyes fixed on her, could hear the contained giggles, the malicious whispers. Richard stood beside the piano, arms crossed, a satisfied smile on his face. He had achieved exactly what he wanted, to turn her into the night spectacle, the exotic curiosity to entertain his wealthy guests. "Any problem, dear?" asked one of the women, her tone loaded with false concern. "Stage fright?" More laughter, more humiliation. Clara closed her eyes and breathed deeply. For a moment she tried to transport herself to another place, another time. She remembered her father teaching her not to play just with her hands, but with her heart. She remembered her mother saying that true music comes from the soul, not from technique. When she opened her eyes, something had changed. Her hands stopped trembling. Her shoulders straightened. She positioned her fingers over the keys, and for an instant that seemed to last an eternity. The hall fell into complete silence. Then Clara began to play. The first notes of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major came from the piano like drops of liquid crystal. Each sound perfectly articulated, each musical phrase built with a precision that made even the most skeptical stop whispering. It wasn't just the correct execution of notes, it was something much deeper. It was Clara Martinez, the child prodigy who studied at the Royal Conservatory of London, finally coming home. The sound coming from the piano wasn't what anyone expected. Conversations ceased one by one, like candles being blown out by the wind. First was the nearest table where a group of businessmen stopped in the middle of a discussion about oil investments. Then the table at the back, where the millionaires' wives interrupted their comments about each other's dresses. Within seconds, 200 people were in absolute silence, hypnotized by the music flowing from the hands of a domestic worker. Clara was no longer in the Belmont Mansion's hall. She was back at the Royal Conservatory of London, at 19 years old, when the whole world seemed possible, and music was her native language. Her fingers danced across the keys with an ease that made it seem like the piano was an extension of her own body. Each note carried years of study, sacrifice, love for an art she had been forced to abandon. Richard, who stood beside the piano with a presumptuous smile on his face, began to feel growing unease. This wasn't going as he had planned. The idea was for Clara to play a simple little tune, something that would draw some condescending compliments from the guests and show how refined he was for having a talented maid. But what was happening was completely different. Margaret Sinclair, music critic for the city's most influential newspaper, slowly rose from the table where she was seated and began walking toward the piano. She was a 70-year-old woman with grey hair pulled back in an elegant bun, who had watched the world's best pianists over 5 decades of career. And what she was hearing left her speechless. Other guests did the same, drawn by a magnetic force they couldn't explain. A circle formed around Clara, people approaching as if witnessing something sacred. The sound of heels on marble stopped completely. Even the waiters had put down their trays to listen. Clara moved from the Nocturne to Ballade No. 1 in G minor, also by Chopin, without even noticing the change. Her muscle memory had taken control, and she was playing pieces she had known by heart since age 15. But it wasn't just technical execution. She was telling a story with each chord, each pause, each crescendo. It was the story of her own loss, her fall, her silent resistance during 3 years of humiliation. "My God," whispered one of the women, her eyes brimming with tears. She was holding a champagne glass she no longer remembered having. "She's extraordinary." Thomas Crawford, one of the country's most powerful investors, known for his coldness in business and for never showing emotion in public, had tears streaming down his face. He had no idea why he was crying. He only knew that this music was touching something very deep within him, something he had forgotten existed since childhood. Richard felt cold sweat begin to trickle down his forehead. He looked around and saw something he had never seen before at these parties: genuine emotion. People who spent their entire lives buying and selling, accumulating wealth and power, stood there like children, completely absorbed by Clara's music. The Treasury Minister's wife, a woman known for her arrogance and social coldness, approached the piano with her eyes fixed on Clara's hands. She herself had studied piano as a child, before life led her to other paths, and she recognized mastery when she saw it. "Where did she learn to play like this?" she whispered to her husband, but he was so absorbed in the music that he didn't even hear the question. Clara finished the ballade, and without pause began playing something different. It wasn't Chopin or Bach, or any of the classics Richard had mentioned. It was her own composition, something she had written years ago but never had the courage to play for anyone. It was a piece about loss and rebirth, about finding beauty in pain, about maintaining dignity even when the whole world seems to conspire against you. The music rose and fell like ocean waves, sometimes gentle as a caress, sometimes intense as a storm. Clara had closed her eyes again and was completely lost in her own creation. Her hands moved with a fluidity that mesmerized observers, each movement precise but at the same time full of passion. "Stop!" Richard's voice cut through the air like a whip, but no one moved, not even Clara. She continued playing as if she hadn't heard anything, lost in her own music. "I said stop!" Richard shouted louder, his face red with anger and embarrassment. Some people turned to look at him with evident disapproval, as if he had just committed blasphemy. Margaret Sinclair approached Richard, her eyes shining with an intensity he had never seen in a 70-year-old woman. She had a fearsome reputation in the musical world, known for destroying careers with a negative review or elevating unknown artists to stardom with a single article. "You don't interrupt talent like that, young man." Her voice was low but firm, loaded with decades of authority in the classical music world. "This girl is a genius. Where did you find her?" Richard opened and closed his mouth like a fish out of water. He didn't know what to answer because the truth was too complicated to explain at that moment, and any lie would sound ridiculous in the face of Clara's obvious talent. "She works for me," was all he managed to say. "Works as what?" Margaret asked, but before Richard could answer, she shook her head. "It doesn't matter. What matters is that she needs to be on a stage, not in a private house." Clara reached the climax of her composition, her hands flying across the keys with a passion that made even the waiters stop serving to listen. The music grew in intensity, each chord more powerful than the last, building toward a finale that promised to be emotionally devastating. Dr. Fernando Oliveira, one of the country's most respected cardiologists, found himself thinking about his daughter, who had died young, and how she had loved music. His wife beside him wept openly, remembering the same lost child. They hadn't talked about their daughter in years. The pain was too great, but somehow Clara's music was bringing back not just the sadness, but also the happy memories. A young technology entrepreneur, known for his extreme rationality and for making all decisions based on data, found himself completely moved. He was used to analyzing everything coldly, but couldn't rationally explain why this music affected him so much. When Clara played the last note of her composition, the silence that followed was even deeper than the previous one. It was the kind of silence that only happens after something transcendent, when people need a moment to return to reality, to process what they had just experienced. Then someone began to clap. It was Margaret Sinclair, clapping slowly, but with an intensity that made all the others follow suit. Within seconds, the entire hall exploded in applause. These weren't polite social event claps. They were genuine emotional applause, the kind of ovation given to real artists. Clara finally lifted her eyes from the piano, and it was as if she was waking from a dream. She saw all those people clapping for her, saw tears on faces, saw admiration where before there had been contempt. And when her eyes met Richard's, she saw something she had never seen before: pure fear. He had completely lost control of the situation. What should have been a small orchestrated humiliation had turned into something much bigger. Clara was no longer the timid maid he could manipulate at will. In that moment, she was an artist, and everyone in the room knew it. Margaret Sinclair was the first to approach Clara, who was still sitting on the piano bench, stunned by what had just happened. The music critic had tears in her eyes, something very few people had seen throughout her career. "Dear, I need to speak with you urgently. What you just did, this isn't common talent. Where did you study? With whom? How is it possible that you're here working as—" She stopped, perceiving the delicacy of the situation. Clara looked at Richard, seeking permission to respond, but he was pale, clearly in shock from the turn of events. She decided to speak for herself, for the first time in 3 years. "Royal Conservatory of London, ma'am." A murmur ran through the crowd like a wave. The Royal Conservatory was one of the world's most prestigious musical institutions. It wasn't a place for amateurs or dilettantes. It was where the planet's best musicians perfected their art. "And why are you working as—" Margaret paused again, but this time was interrupted by other guests approaching. "It's a long story," Clara replied quietly, but her voice was heard by several people. Thomas Crawford, still with red eyes from emotion, approached and extended his hand to Clara. "Miss, what you just did was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard in my life, and I've heard Yo-Yo Ma play live." Richard finally recovered his voice, but when he spoke it came out as a desperate shout. "Enough! The presentation is over. Everyone back to your tables." But no one moved. On the contrary, more people approached Clara, wanting to congratulate her, wanting to know more about her. The circle around the piano grew every second, and Richard realized he had made the biggest mistake of his life. Instead of humiliating Clara, he had given her a platform to show the world who she really was. And now, there was no going back. Her music had touched hearts that hadn't been moved in decades, had awakened something in people who lived mechanical lives focused only on profit and status. And Richard Belmont, who only wanted to impress his guests with a display of power over a talented employee, had just discovered that he had freed a genius. The party continued, but had completely changed atmosphere. The guests couldn't stop talking about Clara. Small groups formed in the corners of the hall, and she was the only subject. Conversations about business and investments had been completely forgotten. Everyone wanted to know more about the maid who played like an angel. Margaret Sinclair had managed a few minutes alone with Clara, in a more reserved corner of the hall, and was asking direct questions that made the young woman increasingly uncomfortable. The music critic had taken a small notebook from her purse and was taking notes while they talked. "How old were you when you entered the conservatory?" Margaret asked, holding a wine glass she hadn't even touched. 15. I got a full scholarship." Clara spoke quietly, always keeping an eye on Richard, who was circulating through the hall desperately trying to regain the guests' attention for other subjects. "And when did you leave?" "At 21. I didn't finish the course." Margaret frowned, clearly surprised. "Why? With talent like that, you should be playing on Europe's best stages. You should have an international career." Clara looked away, observing the guests who were still approaching the piano, touching the keys with reverence, as if the instrument had become sacred after her performance. "Some things happened in my family. I had to return to Brazil. It wasn't a lie, but it also wasn't the whole story. The truth was much more painful and complicated than she had the courage to tell a stranger, even if that stranger was one of the country's most respected music critics." On the other side of the hall, Richard was having an increasingly tense conversation with some of his main investors. They wanted to know why he had never mentioned that he had an international-level pianist working in his house as a domestic worker, and the questions were becoming increasingly direct and embarrassing. "It's a bit strange, don't you think, Richard?" said Thomas Crawford, owner of one of the city's largest construction companies, the same man who had cried during Clara's performance. "The girl clearly has higher education from one of the world's best music schools. How did she end up cleaning your house?" Richard forced a smile but was clearly nervous. "She needed work. I needed a trustworthy employee. It was a situation that benefited both of us." "But did you know about her talent?" insisted another investor, a younger man who ran an international investment fund. Richard hesitated a second too long before answering. "I suspected she knew how to play." The answer didn't convince anyone. The men exchanged looks that Richard knew well from years of business, looks of distrust, of questioning. In the corporate world, when people began questioning your integrity and motivations, things could go very wrong very quickly. "Suspecting is one thing," said Crawford, crossing his arms. "But what we just saw isn't amateur work. That girl has international concert-level technique, and you keep her as a domestic worker." Meanwhile, Clara was being introduced to more people than she could memorize. Businessmen, doctors, lawyers, diplomats, all wanted to congratulate her, all wanted to know more about her story. She felt exposed, vulnerable, as if standing in the middle of a stage without knowing what role she should play. Dr. Roberto Mendes, a music producer who had worked with some of the country's most famous artists, approached Clara with eyes shining with professional interest. "Clara, you need to return to playing professionally," he said without beating around the bush. "I can introduce you to some important people, record labels, concert promoters, symphony orchestra conductors." "I don't know if that would be possible," Clara replied, nervously glancing toward Richard. "Why wouldn't it be possible? You're free, aren't you? Not bound to any exclusive work contract?" Clara didn't know how to explain that her situation was much more complicated than it seemed. That she didn't have money to leave her job, had nowhere to live, no longer had the confidence she once had in her own talent. 3 years of daily humiliation had left deep marks on her self-esteem. The Treasury Minister's wife, still moved by the performance, joined the conversation. "Dear, what you just did there was pure art. I studied piano for 10 years when I was young and never ever managed to play with a tenth of your sensitivity." "It was too beautiful," added another woman. "It's been years since I was so moved by music. You reminded me why I used to love classical concerts." People continued approaching, forming a small crowd around Clara. She heard compliments, questions, offers of help, but everything seemed too surreal to be true. For 3 years she had been treated as invisible, as someone worthless, and now suddenly she was the center of attention of some of the country's most influential people. Margaret Sinclair observed everything with professional interest. As an experienced music critic, she knew how to recognize not just technical talent, but also the story behind an artist. And there was something in the way Clara played, an emotional depth that only came from someone who had suffered greatly. "Clara," Margaret said, interrupting the other conversations, "you mentioned you didn't finish your course at the conservatory. May I ask what happened?" Clara hesitated, looking around the circle of expectant faces. These were people she didn't know, who minutes before had seen her as part of the furniture, but who now hung on her every word. "My parents died," she said simply, "in a car accident. I had to return to Brazil to resolve legal matters and ended up without resources to continue my studies." A respectful silence fell over the group. Several people lowered their eyes, clearly moved by the revelation. "And since then you've been working here?" asked Dr. Mendes. "For 3 years. 3 years without playing professionally." Margaret's voice carried barely contained indignation. "This is a crime against art." On the other side of the hall, Richard was completely losing control of the situation. More people approached him with questions about Clara, and he didn't have satisfactory answers. Worse still, some people were beginning to look at him with evident disapproval. The wife of one of the present senators approached him with a severe expression. "Richard, I hope you're paying this girl adequately. Her talent is worth much more than a domestic worker's salary." Of course," Richard replied quickly, but the lie was obvious to everyone. The party continued until almost midnight, but Margaret Sinclair was one of the last to leave. Before going, she approached Clara, who was helping collect empty glasses, automatically returning to her role as maid. "Stop that," Margaret said, taking the tray from Clara's hands. "You're not a maid, not after what I saw tonight." She took a business card from her purse and handed it to Clara. "Call me tomorrow. I need to write an article about you, and I have some contacts that might be very interesting." Margaret looked directly into Clara's eyes with the intensity of someone accustomed to discovering great talents. "Whatever happened in your life that made you stop playing can't continue like this. You have a gift that can't be wasted. It's almost a moral obligation to the world." When the last guest left, Richard locked the entrance door and turned to Clara. The expression on his face was one of contained fury that she had never seen before. It was the fury of a man who had lost control of a situation he himself had created. "In my office, now." Clara went upstairs behind him, her heart beating fast. She knew she was in trouble but couldn't regret what she had done. For a moment, even if just for a few minutes, she had awakened something inside her that had been asleep for years. It had been like breathing after being underwater for too long. Richard closed the office door forcefully and positioned himself behind the solid mahogany desk, his hands resting on the polished surface. He was clearly struggling to control his anger, and Clara could see a vein pulsing in his forehead. "You embarrassed me tonight. Mr. Belmont, I only did what you asked. I played piano for your guests. Don't give me that. Richard began pacing back and forth behind the desk. You know very well that's not what I wanted. I wanted you to play a simple little tune, draw some polite compliments, and that's it. I didn't want you to become the center of attention. Clara remained silent, her hands clasped in front of her body. She knew that anything she said would only make the situation worse. And now everyone will go around talking about how I have a world-class pianist working as a cleaning lady in my house. They'll think I'm some kind of exploiter who takes advantage of people in vulnerable situations. But isn't that what you do? The question came out of Clara's mouth before she could control herself. Richard stopped walking and stared at her with an expression of shock and fury. What did you say? Clara breathed deeply. She had come this far. She wouldn't back down now. 3 years of silent humiliation had created a courage she didn't know she possessed. You hired me knowing I had musical training. You pay me less than you would pay any other domestic worker with my experience. You treat me as if I were inferior, as if I were your property. And today you used me as entertainment to impress your friends. If that's not exploitation, I don't know what is. The silence that followed was tense as a piano string about to break. Richard was clearly struggling to control his anger, and Clara was wondering if she hadn't just signed her own dismissal. You're being ungrateful, Richard said finally, his voice low and dangerous. I gave you a job when no one else would. I gave you a roof, food, stability, and as soon as I have an opportunity, you stab me in the back. I never wanted to stab anyone in the back. I just wanted to play piano. And now you can play as much as you want, because you're fired. Even expecting this possibility, hearing the words was like taking a punch to the stomach. Clara felt the world collapse again, exactly as had happened 3 years ago when everything fell apart. You have until Monday to find another place to stay. And don't even think about using my name as a reference. Clara felt unable to speak. She turned to leave the office, but stopped when she heard Richard's voice one more time. Clara, she turned around. You may have talent, but talent doesn't pay the bills. You're going to find that out the hard way. She left the office and went up to her room, her legs trembling. She sat on the small narrow bed and stared at her own hands. The same hands that hours ago had drawn tears from 200 people, now trembling with fear and uncertainty. But for the first time in 3 years, Clara didn't feel completely lost. Margaret Sinclair was right. She had a gift, and maybe it was time to stop being afraid to use it, even if it meant facing an uncertain future. Margaret's business card was on the bedside table. Clara picked it up and read the printed name. Margaret Sinclair, music critic, National Arts Journal. Tomorrow she would call. Tomorrow she would take the first step to recover the life she had lost 3 years ago. 6 months later, Clara was backstage at the Municipal Theatre, adjusting the black concert dress that Margaret Sinclair had insisted on buying for her. Her hands no longer trembled. After 24 weeks of intensive rehearsals with the Municipal Orchestra, auditions in other cities, and performances at smaller events, she felt at home again in the music world. 10 minutes to stage, announced Sophia, one of the theatre technicians who had become Clara's friend during the preparations. Clara breathed deeply and looked in the dressing room mirror. The woman staring back was completely different from the one who cleaned the Belmont mansion. There was light in her eyes, confidence in her posture, purpose in every movement. But more than that, there was peace, a peace she hadn't felt since before her parents' death. The last 6 months had been an emotional roller coaster. After accepting the audition with the Municipal Orchestra and getting the position as first pianist, other opportunities began appearing like falling dominoes. Invitations to play at classical music festivals, recording proposals, offers to perform in other cities. Margaret Sinclair had kept her word. The article she wrote about Clara, titled "The Hidden Genius: How a Domestic Worker Revealed Herself as the Greatest Pianist of Her Generation," had been republished in newspapers across the country. Clara's phone didn't stop ringing. A gentle knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. It was Margaret, elegant in a navy blue dress, holding a bouquet of white roses. "How are you feeling?" she asked, handing over the flowers. "Ready," Clara replied, and she really felt that way. "More ready than I ever felt." "Sold out," Margaret said with a smile. "Music critics from 5 different newspapers, the culture minister is here, and there are some surprises for you." "What surprises?" Margaret smiled mysteriously. "You'll see, but I can tell you one thing. Your Aunt Helena arrived from Sao Paulo this morning." Clara felt her eyes fill with tears. Helena was her mother's sister, the only family she had left. They had lost contact after the tragedy, when Clara was so lost in her own pain that she had distanced herself from everyone who could remind her of what she had lost. "How did you find her?" "I thought you needed family here today, and she was dying to see you again." They walked together through the corridors to the wings. Clara could hear the murmur of the audience on the other side of the curtain, could feel the electric energy that always preceded a great concert. But this time was different. This time she wasn't playing because someone forced her or because she needed to impress anyone. She was playing because this was what she was born to do. Maestro Roberto approached, already dressed in his gala tailcoat. Over the last months he had become more than a musical director to Clara. He was a mentor, almost a father figure. He saw in her not just technical talent, but an emotional maturity that few artists manage to develop so young. "Clara ready to make history?" he asked, adjusting his bow tie. She nodded. During rehearsals, Roberto had been impressed not just by her technique, but by her ability to interpret and transmit emotion through music. He said she had something rare, the ability to make each person in the audience feel that the music was being played specifically for them. He placed a hand on her shoulder and said, "Tonight, you're not just Clara Whitmore, the pianist. You are Clara Whitmore, the survivor. The woman who lost everything and rebuilt her life through music. That's what makes your art so special." "Ladies and gentlemen," the announcer's voice echoed through the theater, "please welcome the Municipal Orchestra and our guest soloist, Clara Whitmore, performing Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 in C minor, followed by an original composition by the artist herself." Clara walked across the stage toward the piano. The stage lights created a golden path before her. When she turned to acknowledge the audience, her heart swelled with emotion. In the front row, next to Margaret Sinclair, was Helena, her aunt. She had aged in recent years, but her smile was still the same as in Clara's childhood. Helena was already crying before the music began. Her hands covering her face, clearly moved to see her niece return to the stage. In the following rows, Clara recognized faces from the Del Monte mansion party. Thomas Crawford was there with his wife, Dr. Mendez, the music producer, had come with a group of music industry executives. Several people who had been touched by her impromptu performance that fateful night had made a point of attending her official concert. But in the fifth row, Clara saw the greatest surprise. Richard Belmont was sitting alone wearing a dark suit. His face was serious, though not hostile. He avoided her gaze when their eyes met, but the fact that he was there said everything. Clara sat at the piano and placed her hands on the keys. For a moment she closed her eyes and connected with the memory of her parents. She could almost hear her mother whispering words of encouragement. She could almost feel her father beside the piano, like in the old days. When she began to play, it was as though all the years of pain, humiliation, and loss had been transformed into music. Rachmaninoff's concerto, one of the most challenging pieces in the classical repertoire, flowed from her hands as if it were the most natural thing in the world. But this time, it was different. She wasn't just executing the notes. She was telling her story through music. The first movement carried the anguish of losing her parents. The second movement, more melancholic, spoke of the loneliness of recent years and her struggle to survive. The third movement was pure celebration, pure joy at having found her way back home. The orchestra accompanied her flawlessly, Roberto conducting with contagious passion. Clara wasn't just playing with them, she was conversing, creating a musical dialogue that made everyone in the audience feel part of something bigger. During the second movement, Clara looked at the audience and saw tears on dozens of faces. She saw Helena crying openly. She saw Margaret Sinclair with her eyes closed, completely absorbed in the music. And she saw Richard, looking at her with an expression she had never seen before, genuine respect. The third movement demanded everything from her, physically and emotionally. Her hands flew across the keys in technically demanding passages that only a few pianists in the world could perform perfectly. But Clara wasn't just executing. She was living every note, every chord, every silence. When she played the final note of Rachmaninoff's concerto, The theatre erupted in applause, even before the traditional moment of silence. It was a spontaneous, emotional standing ovation, the kind of reaction that happens when the audience witnesses something truly special. But Clara knew the night wasn't over. After a 15-minute break, she would return to the stage to perform her original composition, the piece that had been born from pain and transformed into hope. The music that told the full story of her journey from tragedy to redemption. During the intermission, Clara was greeted by dozens of people backstage. Music critics were already writing enthusiastic reviews on their phones. Other orchestra musicians approached her, eager to collaborate on future projects. Business people offered tempting contracts. Helena was one of the first to find her backstage, and their embrace lasted several minutes. Neither could speak. They just cried from emotion and relief. "Your mother and father would be so proud," Helena finally whispered in Clara's ear. "You honored their memory tonight in a way that goes beyond music." "Thank you for being here," Clara replied. "Having you in the audience made all the difference." Margaret approached with a wide smile. "Clara, you just gave the concert of the decade. I already have 3 record labels wanting to talk to you before the end of the week." But Clara was thinking about something else. "Margaret, did you see who was in the audience? Of course, half the classical music world came to hear you play." "No, I mean Richard. He was there." Margaret frowned. "Interesting. After everything that happened, I didn't expect him to have the courage to show up. I want to speak with him after the concert." "Are you sure? After everything he did?" "I'm sure. He's part of my story, and tonight is about closure, about peace." The bell rang for the second half of the concert, and Clara prepared to return to the stage. The second part would be entirely dedicated to her original composition, a 20-minute piece she had titled Rebirth. It was the music she had started writing at the Del Monte mansion in stolen moments when Richard wasn't around. It was the music she had played on that fateful night when her life changed forever. But now it was complete, matured, transformed by the experience of rebuilding her life from scratch. When she returned to the stage, the silence was absolute. Everyone knew they were about to hear something unique, something never before performed in public. Clara sat at the piano and looked once more at the audience. This time, when her eyes met Richard's, he didn't look away. There was something different in his expression, something she was beginning to recognize as regret. Clara placed her hands on the keys and began to play her own story. The composition Rebirth began softly, like a whisper, sparse notes that felt like raindrops falling into a quiet lake. Clara had divided the piece into 4 movements that told her journey: loss, exile, awakening, and freedom. Each movement was a window into her soul, a musical confession that revealed her deepest wounds and her most precious healing. The first movement, loss, was devastatingly beautiful. Clara relived through music the moment she learned of her parents' death, the sensation of the ground being pulled from beneath her feet, the absolute solitude of losing everything that matters all at once. There was not a single person in the audience untouched by that universal pain, that human experience we all fear. Helena cried silently, remembering the sister she had lost and the niece she had almost lost to grief. Thomas Crawford held his wife's hand tightly, thinking of their children and what it would be like to lose those we love. Even the orchestra musicians, who were merely accompanying with soft instruments, had tears in their eyes. The second movement, Exile, was darker, heavier. It spoke of the lost years, abandoned dreams, the slow death of hope. Clara played with a contained intensity that made the entire theatre hold its breath. It was music about survival, about doing what must be done even when the soul is dead. In the 5th row, Richard found himself thinking not only of Clara's journey, but of his own, of the musical dreams he had abandoned due to family pressure, of the life he had built based on what others expected of him, not what his heart truly desired. It was during this movement that he realized something he had never admitted to himself. He had hired Clara not only because he knew of her talent, but because she represented everything he had once wanted to be, and instead of celebrating that connection, he had tried to destroy it, out of envy and frustration. The third movement, Awakening, began with a single sustained note that gradually evolved into more complex chords. It represented the night of the party at the mansion, the night Clara began to play again after years of silence. But in Clara's musical version, it was not about humiliation. It was about rediscovery, about music finding its voice again. The audience recognized certain motifs she had played that fateful night, but now they were integrated into a greater, more mature narrative. It was like hearing the same story told by someone who had finally understood its true meaning. Margaret Sinclair took mental notes for her next critique, but found herself completely absorbed by the experience. In 40 years of music criticism, she had rarely heard a composition that was at once so personal and so universal. Clara wasn't just playing her story, she was playing the story of everyone who had ever had to start over after losing everything. The fourth and final movement, Freedom, was pure celebration, not the easy celebration of someone who had never suffered, but the deep joy of someone who had found their way back home. Clara's hands danced across the keys with a lightness that dramatically contrasted with the intensity of the previous movements. It was music about second chances, about forgiveness, about the human capacity to transform pain into beauty. The main theme grew and developed, gaining layers of complexity and emotion until it culminated in a finale that made the entire theatre vibrate. When Clara played the last note, the silence that followed was almost sacred. For a few seconds that felt like an eternity. No one moved, no one breathed. It was as if everyone needed a moment to return to reality after a spiritual journey. Then the theatre exploded. The ovation was unlike anything Clara had ever experienced. It wasn't just applause, it was cries of bravo, people on their feet, clapping with tears streaming down their faces. A collective catharsis that had transformed the municipal theatre into a temple of pure emotion. Clara stood from the piano and gave a deep bow. When she straightened up, she searched for familiar faces in the audience. Helena was beaming, clapping with an expression of pride that warmed Clara's heart. Margaret was smiling like a proud mother. And Richard. Richard was clapping too, but there was something different in his expression. The ovation went on for more than 10 minutes. Clara had to return to the stage 3 times to thank the audience, and even then they did not want to let her go. Finally, Roberto gave her a discreet sign to approach the microphone. "Thank you," Clara said, her voice choked with emotion. "Tonight means more to me than a concert. It represents the possibility of starting over, of transforming pain into something beautiful, of finding hope even in the darkest moments." She paused, looking directly at Richard. "I want to thank everyone who has been part of this journey, even those who challenged me in ways I never expected, because it was through those challenges that I discovered my true strength." After the concert backstage, Clara was greeted by a crowd of people. Critics spoke of a rising star. Producers offered million-dollar contracts. Other musicians wanted to collaborate. But Clara was looking for someone in particular. She found Richard outside the theatre, leaning against his car, clearly waiting for her. When she approached, he straightened up, nervous. "Clara," he said simply. "Richard." They were silent for a moment, the weight of the last few months hanging between them. "You came?" Clara finally asked. I had to. I had to hear you play for real. Not as my employee, but as the artist you've always been." Richard took a deep breath before continuing. "Clara, I came here to apologize. Not just for what I said at the party, but for all the time you worked for me. I knew who you were from the first day, and I used it against you." Clara looked at him, seeing the sincerity in his expression. "Why, Richard? Why did you do it?" "Because I was jealous. Jealous of your talent, your courage, the life you had lived. I always wanted to be a musician. I always dreamed of playing piano like you do, but I never had the courage to follow my dreams." He paused, struggling to find the right words. "When I hired you, I thought it would be a way to keep music close to me. But instead of celebrating your talent, I tried to control it, own it. It was petty and cruel of me." Clara felt a wave of emotion, but it wasn't anger. It was something closer to compassion. "Richard, you can still learn piano. You can still follow your dreams." He laughed, but it was a sad laugh. "I'm 43, Clara. It's too late. My parents used to say that music has no age, only soul. If you truly want to, it's never too late." Richard looked at her with a cautious expression of hope. "Would you give me lessons?" Clara smiled. "We'll see. First, you need to buy a real piano, not just a decorative piece." "I already did," he said quickly. "Last week. A Yamaha. Clara laughed, surprised. So, you've been planning this for a while, since the night of the party. Since I realized I had wasted my whole life doing what others expected of me. Margaret Sinclair approached, interrupting the conversation. Clara, sorry to intrude, but there are 3 journalists who want to interview you and a producer from London who flew in just to hear you perform. Clara looked at Richard. I have to go, but call me next week. We'll talk about those lessons. Richard smiled, and for the first time since Clara had known him, it was a genuine smile. Thank you, Clara. For everything. 6 months later, Clara was performing her 5th concert as a soloist with the Municipal Orchestra. Her career had taken off in a way she had never imagined. She had played at international festivals, recorded an album that became one of the top-selling classical music releases, and received invitations to perform in the finest concert halls of Europe. But what made her happiest were the Tuesday and Thursday afternoons at Richard's mansion, teaching him piano. He had turned out to be a dedicated and surprisingly talented student. He would never be a virtuoso, but he played with a genuine emotion that made up for any technical limitation. You're improving a lot, Clara said, after a particularly good lesson. Maybe next year you can play with me at a charity concert, Richard laughed. That might be a little too ambitious. Never underestimate the power of music to transform lives, Clara replied. Look at what happened to us. They were sitting in the hall where everything had begun, but now the piano was no longer just a decorative object. It was a living instrument, used daily, loved and respected. Clara, Richard said, suddenly serious, there's something I never told you about that night. The party. What is it? When you started to play, when I realized I had lost control of the situation for the first time in my life, I felt proud of something I had done. Because it was through my stupidity that the world discovered your talent. Clara smiled. Richard, if you hadn't done what you did, I would still be hiding, wasting my talent out of fear. Sometimes the worst things that happen to us are what push us to where we truly belong. Richard walked to the piano and began playing a simple tune, one of the first Clara had taught him. It was Debussy's Clair de Lune, but he played it with such tenderness that even this familiar piece sounded special. Clara joined him on the bench and began to improvise an accompaniment. In that moment, they were no longer former boss and former maid, no longer the millionaire and the rising artist. They were simply 2 people who had found, in music, a way to heal old wounds and build a true friendship. Outside the mansion, the sun was setting over the city, painting the sky with the same colors Clara felt in her heart. Gold like hope, pink like gratitude, purple like the peace of someone who had finally found their place in the world. The music continued to echo through the house, a melody of redemption and new beginnings, a symphony of 2 lives that had learned it's never too late to become who you were always meant to be. And sometimes, what feels like the end is only the beginning of something far more beautiful.